Environmental factors play a massive role in warfare, and terrain is a major aspect of any land environment. Some terrains are more favorable than others, and most change drastically depending on the climate, season, and even time of day. While terrain can certainly affect other military branches, it's the army that's up close and personal with the ground, which is to say that soldiers, beasts of burden, and ground vehicles suffer the most while traversing or fighting on crappy terrain. In this second installment of our videos on battlefield terrains, we're going to discuss 5 more of the worst terrains endured by the soldiers of the Second World War. Bocage is a particularly interesting one. Roughly, bocage is a terrain of mixed woodland and pasture defined by narrow rivers, sunken farm lanes, and hedgerows grown on made embankments. It is, so to speak, unnatural. Bocage is common in northern France, most notably in the French region of Normandy. While bocage country might be beautiful during times of peace, it was verdant hell during the Battle of Normandy, especially for the Allies. Generally, the hedgerows were around 2 to 6 feet wide and 3 to 15 feet high, and composed of a virtually impassable tangle of trees, prickly brambles, and shrubs. Most fields the hedgerows enclosed were small, no larger than, quote, an American football field. Together, these factors created compartmentalized battlefields which greatly reduced visibility, making it difficult to deploy large forces, maintain a sense of direction, observe the enemy from a safe distance, and train mortar and artillery fire. For the Allies, the bocage of Normandy was essentially a maze, made even more difficult to navigate by the German defenses woven tightly throughout the region. The Germans dug machine gun positions into the embankments on the opposite corners of the fields to lay waste to any Allied forces unfortunate enough to get stuck in the crossfire. The fields were, in general, kill zones. The Germans wrecked the Allies with preset mortars here, with mortar fire being responsible for as much as 75% of American casualties throughout the battle. The Germans littered the hedgerows with mines and booby traps too, and were especially fond of tripwire explosives. This encouraged the attacking forces to head for natural breaks in the terrain, and these were essentially kill funnels. Allied tanks struggled to break through the hedgerows, and often enemy tanks or infantrymen with Panzerfausts were waiting around the corner to blow them to smithereens anyway. In the words of historian Stephen Ambrose, no terrain in the world was better suited for defensive action. While forests can provide cover and open up surprise attack opportunities, forest warfare is not without its issues. As with bocage countryside, forests can lend a helping hand to a defending force which can weave its defenses through the trees, setting up camouflage positions, knots of barbed wire, well-concealed minefields, and other sorts of traps. Forests can also render air support impossible and stop ground vehicles in their tracks, meaning more soldiers are on their feet and thus vulnerable to traps. A great example of forest warfare from World War II is the infamous Battle of Hürtgen Forest. This dense forest terrain was made even more atrocious by the freezing, muddy, snowy conditions. The Americans had a seriously tough time pushing their way through the trees toward a deeply entrenched German position, only to take immense casualties and lose out in the end anyway. As per American historian Robert S. Rush, the Hürtgen Forest was a horrible place in which to fight. Dark and dense, even the sun's rays produced only a twilight effect at noon. One of the worst things they faced, though, were mines. In the words of American veteran George Wilson, it was there, in that green forest, that we ran into the most frightening weapon of the war. The one that made us almost sick with fear. Anti-personnel mines. They were vicious, deadly, inhuman. They churned our guts. Speaking of dense vegetation, among the very worst terrains you can possibly imagine are tropical jungles. Thick jungles make large-scale movements and vehicular transport virtually impossible. The heat and humidity can drain soldiers of their fluids and exhaust them. With stagnant puddles and ever-present mud, jungles are breeding grounds for insects and disease. The trees can provide cover, but this goes for the enemy too, making ambushes a serious issue. The Kokoda track campaign, fought mostly between the Aussies and Japanese in Papua New Guinea, illustrated the horrors of jungle warfare pretty well. While 625 Australians lost their lives on the Kokoda track, a further 4,000 became casualties of tropical disease. Malaria was the big one, but soldiers suffered dengue fever, beriberi, scrub typhus, tropical ulcers, and dysentery, among a range of other terrible afflictions. While we don't know exactly how many Japanese succumbed to disease, they copped it even harder than the Aussies due to limited food, limited medicine, and poor sanitation. According to a journal article researcher, Stephen Bullard, of the 13,000 Japanese soldiers who died during the campaigns in Papua New Guinea in 1942 and 1943, more perished from sickness and disease than from battle. There was also evidence that the Japanese resorted to cannibalism to make up for their dismal supplies. Overall, in the words of Australian veteran Alan Kanga Moore, it was a terrible place. We and the Japanese were both living in disgusting conditions. In reality, the Kokoda track campaign was fought over jungle-covered mountains, so the soldiers who served there really got the worst of both worlds. This brings us to our next terrain, mountains. Ignoring the climates often associated with higher altitudes, mountains are generally difficult to traverse. With steep, craggy slopes, troop movement can be slow and exhausting, while vehicular transport may be impossible. Falls, rock slides, and avalanches are also worthy of concern. Naturally, mountains lend themselves to defense, as defenders can dig in at higher elevations and shred their enemy from above. The Battle of Monte Cassino might come to mind when you think of mountain warfare. Here, a highly diverse Allied force staged an assault on the German-held Gustav Line in Italy, with much of their focus on the hilltop abbey. Clambering up to the abbey, and the mountains behind it, was no easy thing. The Germans had a superior defensive position, and the Allies had to negotiate jagged mountain slopes strewn with boulders, ravines, and gullies. As the ground was all stone, they couldn't dig in and were thus exposed to enemy fire from higher up. Rock slides were common, and shell fire caused the stone to detonate and split rock shrapnel everywhere. The Allies eventually broke through, but they paid for it dearly, taking 54,000 to 55,000 casualties. Some of the units that proved most crucial in that victory were composed of Moroccan Gumas, specialized in mountain warfare. Fighting a little closer to sea level, as in on a beach, is no easy thing either, especially for the side trying to land on said beach. Wading through the shallows and running on sand is difficult enough, let alone scaling coastal cliff faces concealing enemy positions. The Normandy landings are perhaps the most famous example of this, but the US Marine landings on Iwo Jima were horrible too. The Japanese forces defending that sulfur-reeking island had dug in deep and concealed their artillery emplacements in the mountain. Exiting their amphibious landing vehicles, the Marines trudged through soft volcanic ash up a steep shore, all without a peep from the enemy. When they had made it a way up the shore, the Japanese opened fire, ruining them with small arms, mortars, and artillery. Due to the composition of the ash and sand, the Marines couldn't dig in. As with the D-Day landings, they had nowhere to go but forward. Tanks and armored vehicles were similarly bogged down, sometimes just beyond the reach of the waves. In the words of historians Derek Wright and Gordon L. Rotman, Marines were trained to move rapidly forward. Here they could only plod. Many decided to dump their packs. The most important pieces of equipment at that moment were weapons and ammunition. And as per The Battle for Iwo Jima by Robert Leckie, shells screeched and crashed. Every hammock spat automatic fire, and the very soil underfoot erupted with hundreds of exploding landmines. There were few places to hide. Iwo's peculiar sands slid back into the foxholes and filled them in again. As we said in the first installment on battlefield terrain, it's important to remember that the horror of these terrains was, to an extent, a subjective thing, with most terrains favoring the defender and with training and equipment making a massive difference. In other words, soldiers trained and equipped to fight in a specific terrain are almost always going to perform better in that terrain. We're interested to hear what you think though. Which of the terrains we've covered in this video do you think would have been the absolute worst? Can you think of any other terrains we didn't cover in these videos? Lastly, do you know of any great stories or quotes to do with the terrains of World War II? Let us know all that and more in the comment section below. As always guys, thank you so much for watching and I hope you learned something new.